May 7, 1945, near Leipzig, Germany. The war had ended that very morning, but the silence that settled over the ruined town felt more dangerous than the artillery that had shaken it for years. Smoke drifted lazily from collapsed roofs. Church bells, once symbols of order, lay cracked in the streets. And in the center of what used to be a quiet marketplace, a young German woman knelt on her hands and knees inside the ruins of her family bakery, clawing through bricks and ash like an animal searching for something lost. Her name was Margaret Fischer, 26 years old, weighing scarcely 80 pounds. Hunger had carved away whatever softness her face once held. Her collarbones rose sharply beneath a soot-stained dress. Every breath she drew seemed to scrape her ribs from the inside. She had been kneeling there since dawn, fingers bleeding as she sifted through pulverized flour sacks and shattered shelves, hoping, against reason, that a handful of grain might have been spared from the fire that consumed her home. The bakery had belonged to her family for nearly 3 decades. Bread had once been its smell, its heartbeat, its comfort. Now it smelled only of charcoal and wet stone. The destruction of the building was just one small echo of Germany's collapse. In town after town, families wandered among rubble in search of food the way Margaret did now, desperate, silent, half-broken. Germany that spring was a ghost country. Millions were displaced, millions more were starving. Cities that once defined European culture lay flattened. Children picked through trash heaps. Old men died quietly on park benches. The Third Reich had promised glory. Instead, it had delivered hunger so deep that an entire nation found itself crawling, begging, scavenging. Even as the guns fell silent, death continued its slow harvest. Margaret's hand closed around something, a hard kernel of wheat, just one. She lifted it to her lips with trembling fingers before the absurdity of it all made her drop it into her palm and stare. A single grain. A single moment of survival. That was what Germany had been reduced to. She didn't hear the jeep until it braked. The engine coughed once, then quieted. Boots stepped onto the broken cobblestones behind her, crushing glass under heavy soles. She froze. A shadow stretched across the rubble. For a heartbeat, the air itself seemed to tighten around her. Every rumor she'd heard about Americans roared to life in her mind. They kill captives. They torch villages. They humiliate German women. They are not human. She kept her eyes on the ground, too weak to run, too terrified to look up. A man's voice broke the stillness. "Ma'am, what are you doing?" She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Soft, uncertain. Not cruel. That confused her more than any threat would have. The American sergeant took one careful step closer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform dusty from weeks of marching. His name, Sergeant William James Barker, was stitched above his pocket. He had landed in Normandy 11 months earlier. He had fought across hedgerows and winter forests and river crossings soaked in blood. Now he stood in a country that had finally surrendered, surrounded by civilians who looked more like ghosts than enemies. Margaret finally forced herself to look at him. Her face was empty, exhausted. Her lips were cracked. She clutched a few grains in her fist as though he might strike her and scatter them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the sergeant knelt, slowly, carefully, until he was level with her in the rubble. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't shout. He didn't order her to stand. Instead, he studied the handful of grain she held with a quiet horror that had nothing to do with her nationality. Here, in front of him, was not a German enemy. Here was a young woman who was losing a war she never had the strength to fight. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small object. A U.S. Army D-ration bar. Chocolate so dense it could break a man's tooth. Bitter, heavy, meant for soldiers on the verge of collapse. Margarete recoiled, convinced it was poison. So the sergeant broke off a piece and ate it himself. Then he held the rest out to her. Her hand remained frozen. Her eyes flicked from the chocolate to his face. She expected cruelty. She expected mockery. She expected the world she had been warned about. but the man only said quietly, "You're mine now. Not a threat, not ownership, a promise, a vow to protect a starving stranger because America, even in the ruins of its enemy, refused to abandon its humanity." For a moment, Margaret didn't breathe, and for the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the hunger and fear. Hope? The town was silent around them. Germany had fallen. The war was over. And in the middle of all this devastation, an American soldier had chosen mercy. A small act, almost invisible. But it was the first crack in everything Margaret thought she knew. Margaret did not eat the chocolate the sergeant offered. She stared at it the way a wounded animal might stare at an open trap, suspicious, trembling, waiting for the hidden mechanism to snap shut. Her fingers curled around the grain dust still clinging to her palm, as if that faint scrap of familiarity could protect her from the unknown man crouched beside her. The sergeant saw the fear in her face long before she spoke. It wasn't the ordinary fear of a civilian who had encountered a stranger. It was deeper, older, planted in her long before she ever saw an American uniform. Her chest rose and fell in fast, shallow breaths, and her eyes darted around the square as if expecting more soldiers to emerge and drag her away. When he extended the chocolate a little closer, she flinched so violently he froze. What she whispered next was not English. But even without knowing the language, he understood the meaning. "No, don't touch me." Her body shook, not from cold, from conviction. For years, she had been told exactly what would happen to her if the Americans came. Posters tacked to bakery windows had warned that American soldiers were mongrels, men of mixed blood who lacked discipline, morality, and honor. Radio broadcasts had described enemy troops as savage, half-wild men who would tear apart German homes, take German women as spoils, and laugh while doing it. Newspapers urged citizens to fight to the last breath, insisting that surrender meant humiliation and certain death. Margaret had believed it, because she had been taught to believe it since she was a girl. Her entire world had been shaped by voices repeating the same dark mantra. America is barbaric. America is chaos. America is a land of criminals and weak men who hide behind machines. Now, one of those supposed monsters knelt only inches from her. He didn't yell. He didn't advance. He simply held the chocolate in one open hand, as if waiting for a skittish bird to trust him. But kindness, in this moment, was not comforting. It was terrifying, because nothing in her world had prepared her for it. The sergeant tried speaking again, slower this time, his voice softer. "It's okay," he said. "Food. For you." But to Margaret, the foreign sounds only fed her dread. She scooted backward, scraping her knees on broken tile. Her voice cracked into a frightened whisper, German words tumbling out in fragments. Warnings, rumors, desperate pleas to a man who didn't understand them. He took a small breath and did the only thing he could think of. He placed the chocolate on a piece of broken wood between them, then leaned back, palms open, letting her see that he wasn't forcing anything. He knew fear when he saw it. He had seen it in Normandy, in Belgium, in the Ardennes, in foxholes filled with boys barely out of high school. But this fear was different. This was not the fear of battle. This was the fear of a woman who expected cruelty because she had been promised nothing else. While Margaret hesitated, the sergeant looked around at the ruins, the empty windows, the charred beams, the dust drifting through the air like fine snow. Germany had been reduced to a skeleton. But America, thousands of miles away, was something else entirely. He had come from a country where store shelves were full, where factories thundered day and night, where children grew up healthy despite the depression because their communities held them up. A country where volunteers planted victory gardens while shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than the ocean could swallow them. Where millions had come together, immigrants, farmers, steel workers, women filling factories, to fight a war they hadn't started but were determined to finish. a country that prided itself not only on its strength, but on its decency. The propaganda that shaped Margaret's world would have painted him as a brute. But he was a son of Oklahoma farmland, raised by parents who believed a person in need must never be turned away. He had survived the Great Depression not by hardness, but by community. Neighbors sharing flour when one family ran out, mothers feeding hungry travelers who knocked on their back doors, strangers offering help without expecting anything in return. He couldn't imagine seeing a starving woman and doing anything other than trying to feed her. Margaret couldn't imagine that at all. She watched the chocolate from a distance, her body still rigid. The sergeant noticed the way her gaze kept flicking between the food and his hands. He understood. So he unwrapped the bar, broke off a piece, and ate it himself. Slowly, calmly, showing her there was no trick. Her reaction was immediate, a sharp inhale, confusion flickering behind her fear. She had expected violence, not a demonstration of safety. He nudged the rest toward her and waited. Still, she did not reach for it. Her mind clung to the warnings drilled into her for years. Americans poison prisoners. Americans torture women. Americans do not show mercy. Those lies had been repeated with such certainty that they had become her truth. Her stomach growled loudly enough to echo off the broken walls. She shut her eyes in shame, gripping her ribs as if trying to quiet the sound. Hunger had become her shadow, her companion, her captor. But still she did not take the food. Fear outweighed hunger. And that was when the sergeant finally realized just how deep the damage ran. The woman wasn't just starving. She had been taught to fear the only people who could help her. She had been locked inside a cage of someone else's making. He spoke again, not knowing whether she understood a single word. "You're safe now. You're not alone. No one is going to hurt you." Margaret didn't understand the words, but she heard the tone, a tone she hadn't heard from a man since her father died in the bombings, a tone so gentle it made her breathe unevenly. Further down the street, more American soldiers were arriving, medics carrying supplies, Red Cross volunteers stepping carefully around debris, engineers assessing collapsed structures. Their movements were orderly, purposeful. They called out to one another with calm voices. None of them behaved like the demons her government had promised. And in that moment, an uneasy thought began to uncoil inside her chest. What if everything she had been taught about these men was wrong? The sergeant watched her wrestle with the idea. He didn't rush her. He didn't push. He simply remained there, kneeling, a quiet figure of patience in a wasteland built by cruelty. The chocolate lay between them like a fragile bridge. Finally, with a trembling hand, she reached. Not for the sergeant, for survival. Her fingers closed around the small piece of food. She didn't eat it immediately. She held it like a question, like a confession, like something too precious for a world that had taken everything else from her. The sergeant exhaled, relieved. For Margaret, the fear did not vanish. Not yet. But something shifted beneath it. A crack in the foundation of terror, a small opening through which another idea could someday grow. Maybe the Americans weren't what she had been told. Maybe the world was not what she had believed. Maybe mercy was real. And mercy, she realized, was far more terrifying than cruelty, because it demanded she rethink the entire shape of her world. For a long moment, Margaret simply held the chocolate in her hand without tasting it. Hunger pressed against her ribs like a fist, but fear still stood guard inside her chest. She watched the American sergeant carefully, as if expecting him to snatch the food away or reveal some hidden cruelty the moment she let her guard slip. But he only sat there, palms open, gaze steady, breathing the same dust-heavy air she did. That was what broke her first, the quietness of him. At last, she lifted the chocolate to her mouth. The piece was small, brittle, and melted almost instantly on her tongue. Sugar, milk, cocoa. The memory of flavor shocked her more than any gunshot ever had. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a few seconds she forgot where she was. She forgot the rubble, the hunger, the war that had stolen her family. In that single taste, she remembered being a child in her mother's kitchen, sneaking bits of chocolate from holiday tins. When she opened her eyes again, the sergeant was still watching her, not with suspicion, not with triumph, but with something she didn't recognize at first. Relief. Good, he murmured. She didn't understand the word, but she understood the expression. For the first time, she believed he meant her no harm. He rose slowly, dusting the ash from his knees, then pointed to himself. "Will," he said. Then he pointed to her. She hesitated, then whispered, "Marguerite." He nodded, repeating her name gently as if confirming he had heard it correctly. Then, with a final glance toward the ruined street, he stepped back and left her there with the last piece of chocolate melting in her hand. But he returned the next morning. And the morning after that. And every day that followed. At first, she ran when she saw him approaching, hiding behind broken walls or slipping down into the cellar where she'd been sleeping. But the sergeant, Will, did not give chase. He simply left food where she could see it, a piece of bread wrapped in wax paper, a boiled egg, half a tin of soup kept warm beneath his coat. He would place the ration somewhere obvious, step several paces back, and wait until she gathered enough courage to approach. Sometimes she ate while he watched. Sometimes she waited until he left. But each day, the trembling in her hands lessened. Each day, her breaths slowed from fear into something closer to disbelief. The Americans weren't supposed to do this. Nothing in her life had prepared her for an enemy who fed instead of punished. For the first week, she barely spoke. Her English was poor, his German non-existent. But slowly, piece by piece, they built a fragile vocabulary. Eat, safe, water, tomorrow. At times, he brought an interpreter, an older German man who'd lived in the United States before the war and now wore a Red Cross armband. Through him, Will explained that civilians were being registered for aid, that food distribution points were being established, that the U.S. Army was working to stabilize the region. Margaret listened in stunned silence. The Reich had always claimed America was collapsing from within. Yet here were Americans rebuilding the very country that had declared them mortal enemies. One morning, after she had regained enough strength to stand without swaying, Will handed her something she had not expected, a small cloth bag filled with flour. She stared at it as though it were a relic from another world. Her hands tightened around the fabric. Where get this?" she asked through the interpreter. "Army stores," the man replied. "There's plenty more. America's producing more food than its soldiers can eat." Will shrugged as if this abundance were nothing extraordinary. And Margaret realized another truth. America was fighting a war on two fronts and still had enough to feed its enemies. It didn't seem possible. Germany had been starving long before the final winter. Civilians fought over potatoes in the streets. Soldiers at the front survived on watered-down soup. Her own bakery had been commandeered for 2 years, flour requisitioned straight from the mill to the military. But Will spoke of America as though hunger was something distant, something solved, something unthinkable. He told her of wheat fields in Kansas that stretched farther than a person could walk in a day, of canneries in California running 24 hours a day, a factory so huge they produced more food in a month than her town had seen in a year. The contrast made her dizzy, and it made her realize something deeper. If America had wanted to starve the Germans, it easily could have, but instead it chose to feed them. Eventually, Will brought news that civilian refugees would be placed into temporary housing and given ration cards. That was when she asked the question she had been avoiding. Not prison. He shook his head firmly. No, civilians. You're not POW. Her breath caught. Germany had drilled into her that Americans took pleasure in filling camps, in locking people behind fences, in degrading their captives. But, as Will explained, she learned that even German prisoners of war, The actual soldiers who had fought against America were treated with dignity she had never imagined. The interpreter spoke slowly, letting each fact settle into her thoughts. American POW camps were governed strictly by the Geneva Convention. German prisoners received 3 full meals a day, sometimes more than American soldiers on the front lines. Calorie counts averaged 3,200 to 4,000 per day. They were paid for their labor. They had libraries, orchestras, soccer leagues, and classes in English, mathematics, agriculture, even philosophy. They attended church on Sundays. They wrote letters home, censored but delivered faithfully. Some learned trades in the camps that later helped them rebuild Germany. She stared at the interpreter as if he were reciting fiction. "Why?" she asked. Will answered for himself this time, tapping a finger lightly against the Red Cross emblem on the man's sleeve. "Because it's the law," he said, then paused, searching for another phrase. And, "because it's right." For a woman who had seen nothing but brutality from her own government, the idea of an enemy adhering to rules of compassion felt more impossible than the war itself. As the days passed, Margaret followed Will through the town's recovery efforts, watching American soldiers work with a seriousness that humbled her. They distributed food to children first. They helped elderly men who could barely walk. They cleared debris from roads to allow aid trucks to pass. They set up makeshift clinics, treating wounds without asking whether the patient had once waved a Nazi flag. She noticed something else too, the diversity. Soldiers of different backgrounds stood shoulder to shoulder. Irish last names, Italian accents, Jewish chaplains, black medics from units she had been told did not exist because Germany insisted America was too racially mixed to be strong. Yet here they were, working with discipline, unity, and compassion that contradicted every lie she had been fed since childhood. This, she thought, was America. Not weakness, not chaos, not moral decay, but a nation held together by something stronger than fear, principle. One afternoon, Will led her to a group of German POWs who had been captured months earlier. They stood in line outside an American field kitchen, laughing quietly among themselves, no longer gaunt, no longer hollow-eyed. Their faces were fuller, their clothes clean, their movements relaxed. When the cook handed each prisoner a tray, Margaret saw the portions: meat, potatoes, bread, even coffee. Enough to feed a family here. One prisoner, noticing her astonishment, offered a small nod. "Americans," he said in slow English. "They feed us better than Germany ever did." She didn't know whether to weep or smile. Later, Will walked her back to the ruins of the bakery where he had first found her. The sun hung low, turning the broken bricks gold. She stopped to look at the rubble differently now, not as a grave, but as a beginning. "Tomorrow," Will said, pointing down the street. "Registration, papers, housing." She nodded. She wasn't trembling anymore. When he turned to go, she reached out instinctively, catching the sleeve of his uniform. It was the first time she had willingly touched him. He paused, meeting her eyes. Thank you," she said softly, each word heavy with the weight of everything she could not yet express. He offered a quiet smile. "You're welcome, Margaret." It was simple. It was human. It was enough. That night, as she lay beneath the remnants of a roof that no longer kept out the wind, Margaret held the last crumbs of chocolate between her fingers. Not to eat, just to remember. She thought about what she had been told all her life, about what she had seen instead, about the soldier who brought her food every day without expecting anything in return, about the country that treated even its enemies with a decency Germany had never shown its own people. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the ash and fear and grief, something warm began to thaw. A fragile admiration for a nation she had been raised to hate. For America. For the people who had come from half a world away not only to defeat her country's army, but to save its civilians from starvation. for the generation of men who fought like warriors but acted like guardians. She closed her eyes and whispered a thought she never would have believed even a week earlier. Maybe. They are not the enemy. For several days after she first followed Will through the aid stations and field kitchens, Margaret carried her newly issued ration card in both hands as if it were something fragile, something that might disappear if she blinked too long. Food, safety, treatment, medicine, shelter. Each day brought something she had never expected from the Americans, and with every kindness given, the weight inside her chest grew heavier instead of lighter. She did not understand why. By the end of that first week, the tremble in her voice had softened. The hollowness in her cheeks had begun to lift. The world around her no longer looked like a battlefield, but like the beginnings of a place that could be lived in again. She had even begun to anticipate the sound of the sergeant's footsteps approaching down the ruined street, steady, familiar, a quiet metronome that reminded her of the world before the war stole everything. But kindness, she found, was a strange torment. It demanded something she wasn't ready to give. It demanded that she let go of what she believed. On the morning it happened, the sky over the village hung gray and heavy, the way skies often looked after too many months of smoke. Will arrived carrying a small cloth parcel, something from the American mess, warm enough that steam drifted faintly from the seams. He held it out to her without ceremony. "Breakfast," he said simply. She took it, her fingers brushing his glove by accident. Inside was bread, real bread, soft and fresh and impossibly warm. The smell nearly overwhelmed her. She had a sudden flash of her father in the bakery's back room, sliding loaves out of the oven with a wooden paddle, flour dusting the air like snow. She swallowed hard. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her English still carried uncertainty, but she no longer feared the words. Will nodded once. He watched her a moment, ensuring she was steady enough to eat, and then turned to help a medic unload crates of dried milk from a truck. It should have been an ordinary moment, one of many they had shared. But as she watched him, a strange tightness gripped her throat, an ache she had been pushing down for days. The Americans were not supposed to act this way. Her fear, the hatred she had been taught, the warnings drilled into her since childhood, they all demanded that she resist believing what she had seen with her own eyes. It was too much. Too different. Too kind. She sat on a piece of fallen stone and stared at the bread in her hands, the steam curling upward like an offering. Her breath shook. Her stomach tightened in knots, not from hunger but from something deeper, an unraveling. She looked up sharply when she realized Will was walking back toward her. Before he could speak, the question burst out of her. "Why?" He paused. "What?" She stood, too quickly, and the bread nearly fell from her grasp. She clutched it again and shook her head, trying to gather the English words she barely had. "Why, help me?" she said. "Why bring food? Every day? Why do this?" Her voice cracked. "You, America. We are enemy." Will stared at her as though hearing the word for the first time. Enemy? It didn't match the woman in front of him. He took a breath, slow and steady. Then he said, with no hesitation, "Because you needed help." She blinked at him, confused. He repeated it more gently. "Not because you're German. Not because you're enemy. Because you needed help." Something in her chest buckled. He said it without pride, without apology, without expecting anything in return. He said it the way someone might say the sky is blue or water is wet, as if it were obvious, as if it didn't require explanation. Her knees weakened. "No," she whispered, almost pleading. "No, this is not what they said." Will frowned slightly. "What who said?" She lifted her hands helplessly. "Germany, radio, posters, everything. They say Americans hate us. They say you kill. They say—" Her voice faltered. "They say you have no honor." He stared at her for a moment, stunned, and then a quiet sadness flickered across his face. Margaret forced herself to continue before courage abandoned her. They say America is weak, a place of criminals, of mixed blood, of no discipline. They say you take women." She flinched at her own words. Will closed his eyes for a second, not in anger, but in something that looked like grief. When he opened them, his voice was calm. "Ma'am, we didn't come all this way to hurt people. We came to stop people from getting hurt." Her breath hitched. He went on. "I won't pretend every American is perfect, but we follow rules for a reason. Geneva Convention. We don't starve prisoners. We don't torture civilians. We don't fight that way." He shook his head. "That's not who we are." Margaret stared at him, at the uniform, at the patches worn from months of marching, at the calloused hands that had offered her food instead of harm. And something inside her broke. Not in pain, in revelation. She pressed both palms to her face, the bread dropping to the earth as sobs tore their way through her body. Not delicate tears. Deep, raw, wrenching sobs, the kind she had not allowed herself in years. She cried for the lies she had believed, for the fear she had carried, for the hate she had been taught, for the father she lost, for the mother she buried, for the world that had collapsed around her because she trusted men who never deserved her trust. Will stepped forward instinctively, as though to steady her, but stopped himself short. He let her cry, let her fold into herself, let the walls she had built crumble without interruption. When she could finally speak again, her voice was thin and broken. "They lied," she whispered. "All my life, they lied." He nodded once, a small, deliberate acknowledgement. Not triumph, not righteousness, just understanding. "Our job wasn't to kill Germans," he said quietly. "Our job was to stop Nazis." She lifted her head at that. He continued. "There's a difference, a big one." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "And America. Why so kind? Why give so much?" Will looked out over the village, the trucks bringing supplies, the medics tending wounds, the engineers mapping out repairs. Then he looked back at her. "We're a lucky country," he said simply. "A blessed one. God's given us plenty. When you've been given plenty, you share it." The words fell into her heart with a weight that felt holy. America wasn't strong because it starved its enemies. America was strong because it fed them. Because mercy, not cruelty, defined its power. Because the men standing in her ruined town had come from a generation forged in hardship, the Great Depression, yet somehow emerged believing in compassion, not bitterness. They had known hunger, but not hatred. They had known loss, but not the desire to inflict it on others. Margaret felt her knees give out again, but this time she sank slowly to the ground, not from fear, but from clarity. Everything she had believed about the Americans had been wrong. Everything she had been told about her own nation's righteousness had been a lie, and standing before her was proof, the kind of proof no propaganda could erase. Will stepped closer, only enough that she knew he hadn't walked away. "You're safe," he said quietly, "as long as we're here." She looked up at him, eyes red, voice trembling. You are good man." He shook his head. "No, just an American." Stunned, she let out a breath that felt like the first true breath she'd taken in years. In that moment, she understood something profound, something she would carry for the rest of her life. America's greatest weapon wasn't its tanks or its planes or its factories. It was its humanity, its mercy, its fairness, its refusal to become the monster it fought. And as she stared at the sergeant, at the warmth in his eyes and the steadiness in his posture, a single thought rose above the ruin inside her. If this is America, then everything I knew is wrong. The war had destroyed her country, but this truth, this kindness, was about to rebuild her. In the days that followed her breakdown, something between them quietly changed. Nothing dramatic. No sudden declarations, just a softening, on her side and on his. After she cried into her palms and whispered the truth she had been terrified to see, Will didn't try to comfort her with words he knew she wouldn't understand. He simply stayed. Not as a soldier guarding a defeated enemy, but as a man witnessing the rebirth of someone who had spent too long surviving on fear alone. The next morning, when he approached her usual spot among the rubble, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't crouched behind broken stone or retreating into shadows. She was standing, waiting for him, clutching the bread he had brought the day before. Her eyes were still red, but steadier. She nodded once when he came near. For them, that was enough. The Americans were beginning to organize the town more formally by then. Refugee lists, aid distribution, temporary housing. It was messy work, chaotic, loud, and exhausting. But it was the kind of chaos that built instead of destroyed. One morning, Will pointed down the street and said a word she had learned to recognize. "Come." She followed. They walked past burned-out buildings, shattered windows, and walls that no longer remembered what they supported. But beyond the ruins was movement. Orderly, determined. Red Cross tents flapped in the wind. Medics crouched beside civilians with makeshift stretchers. Soldiers unloaded crates onto long wooden tables. Life, she realized, was returning. Will guided her toward a registration line that snaked around what had once been the village post office. A volunteer from the Red Cross, a woman with gray hair tucked into a kerchief, knelt in front of 2 German children and ladled warm porridge into tin cups. The children stared at the steaming bowls as if they didn't trust their own eyes. Margaret stopped walking. She couldn't look away. During the last winter of the war, she had seen children dig through trash bins behind Wehrmacht supply trucks, fighting over potato peels. Now, American volunteers gently brushed dirt from their hair and wiped their faces with soft cloths. Will glanced at her, reading her expression. "Kids first," he said quietly. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Good," she whispered. A few yards away, an American medic knelt beside an elderly German man whose leg was wrapped in filthy bandages. With patient hands, the medic cleaned the wound, applied sulfa powder, and rewrapped it with fresh gauze. The old man winced but did not pull away. Margaret's voice trembled. He is German." Will answered without hesitation. "He's hurt." The simplicity of it stunned her. A little further down the road, American engineers stood beside a mass grave dug hastily during the final weeks of the war. German civilians had buried loved ones in fear and desperation, with no priest, no ceremony, no time for grief. Now, U.S. soldiers were carefully exhuming the remains and reburying each person properly, marking each grave with a wooden cross or Star of David when they could identify the deceased. As she watched the soldiers carry each body with gentleness, Margaret felt tears sting her eyes again. Why do they do this?" she whispered. Will hesitated, searching again for words she would understand. Finally, he answered softly, "Respect." She did not know how to respond. Respect was something Germany had stripped away long before the bombs fell. It had vanished in rallies, in propaganda, in orders barked from men who valued obedience over humanity. To see American soldiers, men who had crossed an ocean to fight, treat her dead neighbors with reverence was a truth she could hardly bear. When they reached the front of the registration line, the clerk asked her name, age, and family details. She stumbled over the English, cheeks flushing with frustration. Will stepped in. He repeated her words slowly, guiding her through the process, pointing to each form. When the clerk handed her a provisional identity card and a voucher for food rations, she stared at the documents like they were sacred. "Safe now," Will said gently. She found herself smiling, small, fragile, but real. In the afternoons, he sometimes walked her to the schoolhouse where American soldiers were helping villagers salvage what remained of the building. Children swept glass from the floors while soldiers hammered new boards over empty window frames. Someone had hung a crude but earnest sign near the entrance. "Tomorrow will be better." Will taught her the meaning of each word on the sign. Tomorrow. Better. She repeated them with care, as if trying to rebuild a future syllable by syllable. When she paused, he added another, hope. She held that word in her mind long after he said it. As the days warmed toward early summer, Margaret found herself absorbing pieces of his world through their halting conversations. Will had grown up in Oklahoma. He told her about wheat fields shimmering like oceans in the wind, about Sunday church picnics, about neighbors who helped rebuild barns after storms without being asked. He told her about the Great Depression, how people lined up for bread, how his mother stretched soup to feed strangers, how his father taught him that generosity wasn't something you gave only when you had enough. It was something you gave because someone else needed it more. Margaret listened as if hearing stories from a fairy tale. America, this place she had been told was chaotic and weak, sounded like a land built on decency. A place where families helped neighbors because it was right, not because it was ordered. A place she could not imagine but wanted to. He described main streets lined with small shops, children running through sprinklers on warm evenings, families waving flags at parades. He talked about loud laughter, porch swings, and the 4th of July. For a woman raised in the tightening fist of a dictatorship, whose childhood had been stripped away piece by piece, these stories were almost too beautiful to believe. But when he spoke of them, his voice softened with memory, and she felt something stir inside her chest, a longing she hadn't felt since she was a girl. Home. Not her home, but a home. A place that still existed somewhere in the world. Sometimes, while he described his childhood, she tried to picture a town like the ones he mentioned, a place untouched by bombs where people trusted one another, where unity wasn't a slogan but a way of life. She imagined American factories roaring through the war, Rosie the Riveter, Victory Gardens, Liberty ships sliding into the ocean every few days. She imagined families gathered around radios, listening for news from sons overseas. She imagined a nation strained by sacrifice but unbroken, held together by a shared belief that good could still triumph. And she wondered what it felt like to grow up in such a country. America sounds... She paused, trying to find the right word in English. Beautiful. Will's smile was small but sincere. It is. Then his expression shifted to something deeper. Nostalgia, quiet pride, maybe even grief for a world that was changing too fast. You'd like it, he said. She lowered her gaze, unsure why her heart quickened at the thought. By the second week, she could speak several small English phrases. Thank you. Good morning. You help me. And the one Will kept repeating whenever she doubted herself. You're safe. Her accent was heavy, her grammar uncertain, but every word she learned felt like a stone, placed in the foundation of a new life. One evening, when the day's work had ended and the sun dipped low behind the broken rooftops, Will walked her back to the shell of the bakery. She paused at the doorway, touching the charred brick where her father had once leaned during busy mornings. Then she turned to Will. I learn more, she said, tapping her temple lightly. English. He nodded. I'll teach you. A warm breeze rustled the debris around them. Somewhere in the distance, an American soldier was humming a tune, something soft, steady, unhurried. Margaret breathed deeply, and for the first time since the war began, the air didn't taste like fear. It tasted like possibility, like the first faint echo of a life returning, like hope, whispered in a language she was only beginning to understand. The morning after Will promised to teach her more English, Margaret woke with an unfamiliar sensation in her chest, something light, almost buoyant. Hope had been a stranger to her for so long that she barely recognized it. But it lingered inside her now, fragile yet insistent, like a candle flame fighting to stay lit in a draft. She rose from the blanket she slept on, brushed dust from her skirt, and stepped outside into the morning air. The square was already alive with movement. Red Cross volunteers carrying metal pots that steamed in the crisp air, children darting between carts and crates, soldiers repairing a roof one hammer strike at a time. Order was returning to a world she once believed could never be whole again. And as she watched, she realized that these Americans, these men she had been taught to fear, were the ones restoring that order. She spotted Will near a truck, helping unload sacks of flour. Something inside her steadied at the sight of him, the way a frightened animal might settle in the presence of someone it finally trusts. She made her way toward him, hesitating only once, when the memory of her old beliefs flared suddenly in her mind. Americans are brutes. Americans are cowards. Americans destroy. But the past few weeks had shown her the opposite. Before she could lose her nerve, she called out softly, "Will?" He turned at the sound of her voice and smiled. "Morning, Margaret." The warmth in his tone settled her completely. They walked together down the road, past the schoolhouse where children were being taught again, past the medical tent where American doctors checked fevers and cleaned wounds, past a chapel where a chaplain led quiet prayer in both English and German. Everywhere she looked, she saw something she never expected to associate with the people she once called enemies: compassion. And seeing it forced her to revisit everything she had believed before the war ended. She remembered sitting in crowded halls as a girl, listening to instructors teach lessons about national pride, racial destiny, and the inevitable triumph of the fatherland. She remembered posters plastered on every corner telling her Germany was chosen for greatness, pure, strong, superior. She remembered radio broadcasts insisting that America was a chaotic nation of mixed bloodlines, weak men, and moral corruption. She had believed it, all of it, because believing was safer than questioning. But now, standing beside an American sergeant who carried food for strangers and showed kindness, without agenda, that old certainty crumbled like ash under her feet. She stopped walking, pressing a hand to her chest. Will noticed and turned back to her. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, though her voice trembled. "I think." She drew a deep breath, then forced out the words that had haunted her since the day she tasted that piece of chocolate. "I believed lies." Will waited. He swallowed. "All my life, they told us we were better, chosen, pure, strong." She shook her head slowly. "But Germany starved its own people, and America—" She gestured to the bustling town around them. "America feeds us." For a moment, Will said nothing. His expression softened, not with pity, but with understanding. Then he said a sentence she would remember for the rest of her life. "We fought Nazis, not Germans." She stared at him. "We never hated you," he continued. "We hated what your leaders did. We hated what they made the world become." Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. She needed to hear every word. "And if we hadn't stopped them," he added quietly, "the suffering here would be even worse." Margaret's voice cracked. "You saved us." Will didn't answer immediately. He looked out toward the horizon, toward the Germany that still lay in ruins beyond their small pocket of recovery. "We tried," he said, "and we'll keep trying. War's over. Now, we build." His humility astonished her. She had grown up in a world where leaders boasted endlessly, where strength was proven through domination, where mercy was considered weakness. But Will spoke of victory without pride, of rebuilding without judgment, of compassion without conditions. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. "We were told America wanted to destroy us." "We didn't come to destroy you," he replied. "We came to stop the ones who already were." His words struck her with such force she had to sit on a nearby stone. She felt dizzy with the clarity of it. Everything she had believed had been inverted. The Reich had not protected her. It had deceived her. It had taken her family, her home, her city. Not the usual supply truck. This one sounded heavier, carrying weight that wasn't measured in crates. When she turned toward the sound, she saw Will sitting in the back of an army transport duffel bag at his feet. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, his face streaked with dust from packing. There were other soldiers beside him, men she recognized from town patrols and medical rotations. Her breath caught in her throat. He saw her instantly. His expression softened with something like regret. He hopped down from the back of the truck, boots crunching over pebbles, and walked toward her. "You leave?" she asked. Her English was stronger now, but the words still felt too small. He nodded slowly. "New orders. We're being moved to another sector. Might be France, might be home." He shrugged as if it didn't matter, but the heaviness in his voice betrayed him. "Oh." Her fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. She had known, of course, that he wouldn't stay forever, but knowing something and feeling it were two different realms entirely. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't form. Will reached into his pocket and placed a folded slip of paper in her hand. "For you," he said. She blinked, confused. "What? What is it?" "A reminder." She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was uneven, more printed than cursive, meant to be understood by someone who had learned only bits of English. Not all enemies are enemies. Her breath trembled. He gave a small smile, tired, earnest, proud. "You'll be all right, Margaret. You're stronger than you think." "I am not strong," she whispered. "You survived," he said. "That's strength." She swallowed. "You helped me live." He shook his head gently. "You helped yourself. I just made sure you had food while you did it." She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The truck engine growled again, signaling its final minutes. Will stepped back. "Take care of yourself, and when the world settles, live a good life." She took a step toward him, then another, desperation cutting through her usually quiet demeanor. "Will, wait." But the words collapsed there. She couldn't gather enough language to tell him everything she wanted to say. "Thank you. Please stay. You saved me. I won't forget. You changed everything." All she managed was a breathless, "Thank you." He nodded once, a soldier's farewell, simple but meaningful. Then he climbed into the truck. The engine roared. Gravel spat from beneath the tires. The truck began rolling down the road, slowly at first, then faster, and Margaret ran. She ran after it, stumbling over broken stones, breath burning her lungs. She didn't shout, didn't need to. Will turned on the back of the truck, holding the railing with one hand, watching her chase the disappearing shadow of their unlikely connection. For a moment, their eyes locked. Hers filled with gratitude she couldn't speak. His filled with something quiet and warm and unspoken. Then the truck rounded the bend and vanished. Margaret stood in the road long after the dust settled, the slip of paper clutched tightly in her hand. Not all enemies are enemies. Years passed. Germany rebuilt itself from ashes. Streets were cleared, markets reopened. Children were born who would never know what it felt like to hide in a cellar during bombings. Margaret married, raised 2 children, and rediscovered the rhythms of work and life and laughter. Rhythms she once thought she would never hear again. But she kept the note. Folded in a small wooden box along with her ration card, a photograph of her parents and the last crumbs of that first chocolate. She showed it to her children when they were old enough to understand what it meant to lose everything and still be saved by a stranger. When they were older, she told her grandchildren too, and much later, when one of them moved to America for university, she traveled there. Clarity of it. Everything she had believed had been inverted. The Reich had not protected her. It had deceived her. It had taken her family, her home, her city, and then convinced her to fear the very people who were now saving her life. A hollow ache opened in her chest. My father. He believed them, she whispered. We all did. Will sat beside her, leaving space between them, speaking with the quiet calm of someone who had spent too many nights comforting dying comrades. You couldn't have known. When you grow up, hearing one thing your whole life, it's hard to see anything else. She nodded slowly. But now I see. She looked at him directly, her voice steady for the first time. "You are strong, because you are kind." He didn't smile at that. Instead, a shadow passed behind his eyes, the kind that comes from memories too heavy to revisit lightly. "We tried to stay decent through all this," he said. "War doesn't make it easy." She thought of young American soldiers she'd seen handing out candy to German children, of medics tending to civilians while still bruised from their own battles, of soldiers bowing their heads as they reburied strangers dead. And she knew his words were true. America. She inhaled deeply. America is not what they told us. "No," Will said softly. "And Germany's not what they told us either, I guess." She lowered her gaze. "No, it is not." As the sun began to dip behind the damaged rooftops, casting long shadows across the square, Margaret felt something inside her settle. Not peace. She wasn't sure she would ever feel complete peace again, but clarity. A truth larger than grief, larger than war. Compassion was stronger than ideology. Humanity outlasted hatred, and the country she had been taught to despise had proven its strength not through cruelty, but through mercy. She turned to Will, voice soft but certain. "You changed my life." He shook his head gently. "No, you survived. I just helped." But she knew better. America had saved her, not just with food or shelter, but with a lesson that would live inside her forever. A nation is measured not by what it destroys, but by what it's willing to save. And as she looked at Will, the soldier who had crossed an ocean to fight tyranny, and then stayed to feed the people that tyranny had abandoned, she understood what she would tell her children someday. Not about the fear, not about the hunger, but about the Americans who showed her that goodness could survive even the darkest winter. And she would tell them the same words that now echoed in her heart. Thank God for America. In the weeks that followed her awakening, Margaret found herself looking for Will each morning the way one might look for the first light breaking over the horizon. He had become the steady presence in a world still learning how to breathe again. Some days he arrived with food, some days with papers she needed to sign, and some days simply with a nod that told her she was not alone. She had grown used to that rhythm, so used to it that she never imagined it might end. But war has a way of reminding people that nothing remains still forever. It happened on a warm June afternoon. The sun lay gently over the ruined rooftops, and the town buzzed with new energy, a kind of rebuilding heartbeat that pulsed through every street. Children ran past with bowls of porridge. Red Cross workers unloaded more crates. German civilians swept out the schoolhouse for the first proper lessons in months. Margaret was stacking firewood behind the temporary kitchen when she heard the one of Will's stories. One night, sitting at her grandson's kitchen table in a small town in Indiana, she unfolded the note again. The ink had faded, but the meaning had not. Her grandson looked up from the slip of paper, eyes soft. "He really wrote this?" She nodded. "He saved me. What do you think he'd say about America now?" She hesitated, then answered with the honesty age granted her. "America today forgets sometimes," she said. "Forget who they were. Forget how strong kindness made them." He leaned back, thoughtful. "Do you think they can find it again?" "Yes," she said simply, "because they already had it once. And a country that carries that in its bones can always remember it." She held the note against her heart. "America was strongest," she whispered, "when kindness was its greatest weapon." For the Americans who hear her story today, sons and daughters of that greatest generation, grandchildren of the men who built victory from sacrifice, it hits somewhere deep. A reminder, a reflection, a quiet pride, a gentle ache. A story from a woman who once feared them, who once ran from them, who once believed the worst of them, and who now says without hesitation, "Thank God for the